Namaste children. Hope you're all good. Okay. So what were we discussing in the previous session? We just had an introduction of the chapter diversity in life forms. So as I told you to just remember some of the terms. What were the terms which we discussed? Yes, if you can recall, we discussed variation, classification, characteristics, isn't it? So what are variations? The differences or the diversities which we are observing in the living organisms. Am I clear? So what these diversities have led to some appearance of some new features or some new characteristics, and these characteristics became some like common identity factor or identity factor for some group of organisms. So this has led to the foundation of what a classification. So now this branch of science which is dealing with the classification of all the living organisms, we call it as taxonomy. What is taxonomy? It is a branch of science which deals with the classifications, okay, or classification of organisms, okay, all the life forms, okay, classification of living organisms. So as I discussed in the earlier session, as I told, classification is done based on some similarities and the dissimilarities. Okay, so there are features which are common to all and there are features which are not common to all, and we came to a conclusion in the previous session that the very basic level which is common for all of us is the genetic material, and this genetic material is varying from one group of organisms to the other group of organisms, which has led to the conclusion that the genetic material, or letters or if I say it is nothing but your nucleus, is the basic fundamental unit of classification, and then followed by whom? Followed by cell. Then again further the cell, again depending upon whether they are whether they are autotrophic or whether they are heterotrophic, we have further classified. So as if you see, as we have started, the number of characteristics being taken for grouping the organisms keep on increasing. So thereby that makes us to bring the very closest organism to be kept under one group or one category. Okay, so before we go on to how the classification has been done, let us have a just brief insight into who initiated or who started the process of classification. Now, the very first attempt of classification was done by a scientist by name, I hope you can remember him. Okay, he is Aristotle. Who was Aristotle? He was none other than the father of biology, or even he is also called as father of zoology. So Aristotle is the father of biology because he studied various life forms. Now the very first attempt in classification was done by this very great scientist. But his classification, we can say it was just by observation. It was not with some sort of scientific evidence or proofs or anything like that. The reason is, remember, Aristotle was from before Christ. Okay, so you know at that time we did not have very sophisticated technologies and all. So hence he actually divided his, as per Aristotle, the classification of life forms was only under two groups. That was, one was plants and the other was water, animals. So children, as per Aristotle, the grouping was classification was based as plants and animals. And what was the criteria he has taken? Like plants being autotrophic, animals being heterotrophic. And another most important difference what he observed was plants were non-motile, that is they were stationary, they were fixed, whereas animals were motile. But then this was not a satisfactory classification because it was only a mere observation which led Aristotle to classify these organisms. And then gradually we came to know that there are not alone plants and animals. We also have some organisms like mushrooms, algae, or maybe even microscopic organisms. Now Aristotle was way back from before Christ century. So that time, since this technology was not developed, this was a satisfactory classification. But then later on, as the discoveries happened, as the inventions happened, we came to know that this is not a satisfactory one. Then attempts were made by various scientists. So another next very what we can say, a very important attempt was made by another scientist by name Carlos Linnaeus. Okay, so but then his was also not being satisfactory. Then another scientist by name Whittaker, Robert Whittaker. Okay, Robert Whittaker was the scientist who, in a very detailed manner, classified all the organisms. Okay, in the early 1960s. Now, he was Whittaker's classification was done not by alone himself, but by another set of scientists by name Carl Woos and Ernest Haeckel. So, the set of these three scientists led to the classification of the organisms, which even included the microscopic organisms like bacteria. So we can say now the very modern classification what we are nowadays following is proposed by Whittaker, Woos and Haeckel. So this what he did, he classified all the organisms into 5 groups. Into how many groups? 5 groups, and this each group was called as kingdom. What was it called as? Kingdom. So Whittaker classified all the organisms into how many kingdoms? 5 kingdoms. Into how many kingdoms? 5 kingdoms. And what was his criteria for classification? As we have discussed earlier, he started right from the genetic material, that is nothing but your nucleus. Then the second criteria was the number of cells, and the other next criteria was the presence or absence of cell wall. Okay, and then the mode of nutrition. So this became the very most important criteria for classifying the organisms into this 5 groups, which were termed as what? 5 kingdoms. Am I clear? So the modern day classification is also called as 5 kingdom classification, which is proposed by Whittaker, Woos and Haeckel. Am I clear? Children, we learned that Whittaker classified all the organisms into 5 groups. Okay, that was called as your kingdom. So 5 kingdom classification. But then this was a broader classification wherein every organisms were placed under this 5. Most of the organisms were placed under 5 categories. But then what happened, at every level the number of characteristics were kept on adding. So what happened, this kingdom further kept on dividing to sub levels. Thereby a point came wherein the only one group kind of organisms were kept in the group, which was called as a species. So which led to the development of an hierarchy. They led to a development of what? A hierarchy, which first started with what? A kingdom. Now what was this hierarchy based upon? It was all based upon the number of characteristics, where you see when I place an organism in the kingdom, the number of characteristics which are taken to study are very minimum. Okay, but as I further study them deeper, the number of characteristics keep on adding. So thereby what happens? The sub-levels are created. Okay, so these sub-levels keep on adding till I come to the very bottom one, which is called as what? Species. So in species, I am observing only one kind of organism. Then the question comes, what are the sub-levels between kingdom to species? Okay, so now the kingdom is again further divided into what? Into phylum. Into what? Phylum. Phylum in case of animals and division in case of plants. In case of plants. Then phylum, kingdom, and then phylum, and then next is your class. This was next sub-level. Then next comes order. Then comes family. And then comes genus. And then the last comes what? Species. So every organism will first belong to a certain kingdom. Then it comes to a next sub-level called as phylum, then goes to class, then belongs to order, then belongs to family, genus, and finally it comes to a category called as species. Am I clear? So what is this? This is called as hierarchy. What is this termed as? Hierarchy of classification. And what is the criteria of this hierarchy? The various characteristics which are taken to study. Finally, when we come to species, children, remember this is only one kind of organism. Now how can I say one kind of organism? That is based on their interbreeding capacity. So what a species? A group of organism which can interbreed. So for example, if I say a dog is one species, man is another species, mango is another species, neem is another species. And how did we come to this point? By starting from where? A kingdom. So where in kingdom, if I say I belong to animal category, I belong to animal category, so I am kept under animal kingdom. Then again to next sublevel, then next to sublevel. So finally I come to species category, which is nothing but interbreeding. So what we have seen, children, when this hierarchy is developing, the hierarchy is leading to what? A accumulation of characteristics. But what was my fundamental characteristic which I took into consideration? It was what? A bacteria. It was what? A cell was my basic fundamental unit of classification. And within the cell, what? A genetic material.